Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
I'm Dr Stuart McErlain-Naylor, and I'm joined by Dr Anna Fitzpatrick, a lecturer at Loughborough University in the area of sport performance analysis and sports coaching, particularly from a constraints-led approach, with a background as a professional tennis player for 8 years. Anna's here to discuss performance analysis in tennis, Wimbledon, and the integration of research and applied coaching. Hi Anna, welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. So I know, I've looked into your research quite a bit and it covers a few different areas, but you cover, application of performance analysis within elite sport. You cover aspects of skill acquisition and sports coaching from a constraints-led background, but you've also got your own background in professional tennis. And to start with, I'll maybe just try and unpick that a bit and to try and make sure that everyone's on the same page and knows what we're talking about. We'll maybe just go through each of those and try and give a bit of a background of what it actually is and what we're talking about. So I think just to start with, what is performance analysis within elite sport environments? What does that mean?
Okay, so performance analysis is an objective tool that allows us to quantify or measure different aspects of sports performance in hopefully a reliable way, or a more reliable way than we could do without it. So that might be in competition, it might be in training sessions, and there are lots and lots of different benefits to using performance analysis. We could use it to identify our own strengths and areas for improvement, so areas to focus on in coaching sessions, for example. We could look at our upcoming opposition and try and identify their strengths and weaknesses to help us help inform our match tactics or strategies in advance. We could use it to inform athletes' training programs, to monitor injury rehabilitation. We've seen more recently significant advancements in technology. So, now we can use data and performance analysis to help us quantify movement demands in sport, or identify successful patterns of play, or even sometimes to predict future performance outcomes. If you're anything like me, you might also use analysis to help you win your fantasy football leagues. But yeah, I'm interested in using performance analysis for all those different reasons, and specifically in the context of elite sport. So thinking about how we can use it to positively influence performance at the highest level.
Brilliant. And yeah, I'm definitely interested in how to win the fantasy football league, but I'll probably try and I might come back to that, or I might try and stick to tennis perhaps, I don't know. But the second part of that research background was around skill acquisition and sports coaching and the constraints-led approach. This might be a longer answer or a less straightforward thing to explain maybe, but yeah, for the benefit of people listening, what is a constraints-led approach to sports coaching?
You're right, it is a more drawn out answer. I think it will be, or it takes a little bit more explaining, I suppose. So the constraints-led approach is a theoretical model that demonstrates how perception and action are inherently linked. So in any given scenario, we perceive all the information available to us and then we act accordingly. And a constraint can be any source of information that can influence our behavior, anything that could restrict our behavior or facilitate our behavior. And there are different types of constraint, 3 different types of constraint. So those related to the individual themselves, those related to the environment around the individual, and then those related to the task or activity. So as an individual, this is where it gets a little bit abstract. My interpretation or perception of all of those different types of constraints determines the action or behavior that I take. So if I am waiting to cross the road on my morning dog walk and a car is approaching, whether I have time to cross the road or not successfully depends on lots of constraints. So the speed of the car is traveling is a constraint. The distance the car is away from me is another constraint. My running ability is a constraint related to me as the individual. Whether my dog is paying attention is another constraint, because that might influence my ability to cross the road in time. The weather could be considered an environmental constraint. So if it's very heavy rain, perhaps the road might be quite slippy, depending on what trainers I'm wearing. All of those different constraints influence my ability to cross the road or not in time. So my perception of what we call the interaction of all of those constraints dictates whether or not I cross the road or whether I wait until the car has passed. So in a sports coaching context, if we adopt a constraints-led approach, we as coaches recognize this interaction between the individual or performer constraints, the task constraints, and the environmental constraints. And we try to optimize that interaction by designing our coaching environments, our learning environments accordingly. So we manipulate specific constraints to perhaps encourage certain behaviors that we want to see more of, or discourage other behaviors, or to simply enhance learning. So if I give you an example, pitch size in football is a constraint. So we don't ask 5 and 6-year-old children to play on, to play 11-a-side football on a full-size pitch with full-size goals. Why not? Because it's not appropriate for them. Their individual constraints, so their height, their other physical attributes such as strength, they can't kick the ball far enough. The goalkeepers would never make a save because the goal is far too big for them. The ball is probably a little bit too heavy. So instead, we manipulate those constraints. We make the pitch smaller, we make the goal smaller, we perhaps give them a smaller or lighter ball to play with. We might reduce the number of players on the pitch at any one time. And all of that is designed to help them develop their football skills more effectively. So if then one player is hogging the ball, for example, which we quite often see in children's football, we might change a task constraint and implement a rule that restricts the number of touches that any one player can have before they're required to pass the ball. So all of these are constraints that we change as coaches. We try to manipulate the constraints to enhance skill development, improve performance. And the other key to it is that we try to do these things in a way that means we don't need to explicitly tell our athletes what the problem is or how to solve it. So we set up the activity in a very specific way that we know will encourage the right kind of behaviors and encourage them to find a solution.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think you did a really good job of explaining that actually in a really kind of relatively simple to understand way for something that can be quite complex. What then, to build on your examples of, crossing the road with your dog and then the football pitch size example, what would some example constraints be within tennis that people might be looking to vary within training?
So, I mean, as with the football example that I shared, we have very similar examples in tennis. So for young children just starting out in the sport, we adapt the size of the court. They play on a much smaller court. We adapt the height of the net. We adapt the size and weight of the rackets. We use different tennis balls. So they have lower compression balls that move more slowly through the air and bounce lower, because in a similar way, again, to the football example, if we put 2 6-year-olds on a tennis court, on a full-size court with normal equipment, they wouldn't be able to maintain a rally, and it's not very helpful for them in terms of developing their skill set. So the ball would often bounce above their head. They'd probably hit 1 or maybe 2 shots before they miss and have to go and collect the ball and start again. So we manipulate all of these constraints to allow them to learn the sport more effectively.
Okay, and I know you've done some work with the Lawn Tennis Association, mini tennis in that space that we'll probably come back to in a bit. But I'm trying to picture the application of this beyond junior athletes, because I think that idea of making equipment and courts and pitches and everything specific to developing children, I think is relatively easy to picture in my mind. But when you're working with an elite athlete, what would that look like? Are you still changing the size of the equipment and the size of the pitches and courts, or is it a bit more fine-tuned than that?
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit more fine-tuned than that. So some of the findings from my PhD informed some specific sort of constraint manipulations for at the elite end of the sport. As an example, lots of the research, lots of the studies in my PhD demonstrated how important short points are in tennis matches. And along with that in turn, that demonstrates the importance of the serve and return. So if we know that the first 2, 3, 4 shots are extremely important, we can manipulate the training design or the court design to encourage players to try to win points early, to win points quickly, rather than have long drawn out rallies on the practice court. So as an example, if we implement a second baseline, let's say 0.5 of a meter behind the standard baseline, and we don't allow our players to step behind that, they have to find a way to step inside the court and play more aggressively. You can't really defend if you stay inside the court in tennis. To defend, you step way behind the baseline, and you might hit higher, loopier shots to stay in the rally and give yourself more time to get back in position, etc. But if we restrict players' movement, say they're not allowed more than half a meter behind the baseline, they have to find a way to effectively attack the next shot after the serve.
Okay, I think that's a really good example of what I was going to touch on, of trying to get an understanding of how these different areas of your research interact. And I think you maybe covered that a bit there. So as I'm imagining it, you've got your performance analysis hat on, which uses video-based statistics, etc., to try and determine what is actually important for winning this match. That then links into your coaching skill acquisition hat on. How do you manipulate training environments to try and improve their ability to do that thing that I just showed was important in that research? Is that the kind of idea of how this all fits together? Is you're finding out what someone needs to do to win, and then you're looking at how do I design training to help them do that?
Exactly. The two areas of research are really closely linked. So for me, the interesting part of my performance analysis work is not the collecting of data or the analysing of data. It's about interpreting the data and considering how we can use that information to enhance performance and enhance training environments. The way to do that for me is through effective coaching and like I say, training design. So it's through designing learning environments, designing coaching drills and activities that will encourage athletes to develop the skills or behaviours that our data has shown are important for winning matches.
And I guess your third hat or third area of experience is your own applied experience as a former professional tennis player. So then how does that feed into this whole situation as well? Do you think your own experiences change maybe your approach or your philosophy to research and the way that you blend these different areas? Or do you maybe have any examples you can give of how you maybe approach things slightly differently to what you might do if you didn't have that experience to fall back on?
Definitely. I think I found the transition from being an athlete to being an academic really interesting. As an athlete, I always wanted to know why I was doing something. So essentially, I was looking for the evidence behind the decision making. So why is my coach asking me to play in a certain way? Why do we always do plyometrics during the grass court season? Why do we never do more than 3 long haul trips a year? My strength and conditioning coach, who I worked with throughout my career, in fact, he did his MSc in strength and conditioning at Loughborough. So fortunately, he was able to answer all of my questions and justify why we were doing what we were doing. So when I started university, I was really fascinated learning about the theories and the evidence that underpinned lots of the performance-based decisions that were made during my career. And I started to understand more about how we can improve performance at the highest levels in sport. So in terms of how my playing experiences informed my research, as a player, I also experienced sports science support myself. So I understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of it. And I think perhaps as a result, I maybe have a little bit more insight into when and how things should be communicated to be most effective to players and coaches and ensure that we optimize the impact for that. So, my coaches occasionally would say things at what I didn't feel was an appropriate time. Maybe I'd just lost a match or something and they come to tell me what I should have done in that match. And actually, I kind of just wanted to wallow a little bit and take some time for myself, or maybe talk to my friends or my family, or do something to get my mind off the match that I just lost. So it's the nuances around the delivery of the sports science and performance analysis support that I think maybe have slightly more insight into. you know, as a player, my favourite tournament to compete at was Wimbledon, and I did my whole PhD on how to win matches at Wimbledon. So, you know, I think there's also been a lot of crossover there too.
Great. And yeah, I think I'm really keen to dig into, you know, those studies around how to win matches at Wimbledon. And I'm trying to hold myself back and kind of cover maybe some of the more background information first before we get into it. But just where you talk about the elite support provided to players, and obviously with your background currently in performance analysis, what does that look like? So say someone competing in Wimbledon this year, will they have their own performance analyst? How do those interactions between kind of player and performance analyst typically work, especially because maybe my understanding of this space is a lot more based on what's known around team sports. And I know tennis is likely slightly different. You've also got these, speaking of constraints, maybe in a slightly different way, but you've got this unique constraint where player-coach interactions and things are rather limited in tennis compared to what they might be in other sports. So I'm just interested in, yeah, I guess how that applied world of player, coach, performance analyst, pre-game, in-game, post-game match works really at that elite level in tennis.
Yeah, I mean, performance analysis has been certainly limited in its applications within elite tennis compared to lots of other sports, particularly team sports. There are several different reasons for that. I think primarily with tennis being an individual sport, financially it doesn't make sense to employ an analyst to work with one player. So a player themselves has to fund any of their support team that they choose to employ. So in a football club, an analyst might work with 30 players, whereas in tennis it would just be for one individual, unless you're part of a national federation or an academy or something similar. So financially it's very difficult to justify employing an analyst, particularly because analysis is compared to other sports science disciplines, it's a relatively new discipline or tool. So there's still a lack of understanding from players and coaches around how to use it and how to optimize its application and the different applications that it has. So tennis is definitely behind other sports in that respect. I think that the other, or one of the other barriers, has been that almost all tennis coaches used to be players themselves, and they used to play at a time when we didn't really collect data. So again, kind of leaning towards that lack of understanding that coaches and players might have, there's a lack of familiarity with data and therefore a lack of trust. So the key to starting to break that down is having analysts who can really effectively communicate to players and coaches to help them understand the data, help them understand how it can be used and applied in their everyday working practices. And I think there are a very limited number of analysts who have a strong enough background in the sport to allow them to do that really effectively. To answer your other question around, you know, how does performance analysis work at Wimbledon and that type of thing? So at Wimbledon and at the other Grand Slams, a team of data collectors sit courtside for every match, or one data collector sits courtside for every match and records what's happening. So every time there's a forehand, backhand, error, serve, second serve, double fault, everything like that is coded manually at the side of the court. An automated speed gun will also record the speed of each serve. And then after the match, players, if they want to, can access that data and use it as they wish.
How is that changing with the availability of, you know, things like Hawkeye data? So we're starting to see more things on TV graphics? Like, do players get access to additional data through things like Hawkeye, or is that purely kind of separate at the moment?
Data ownership and accessibility is a really kind of contentious issue. And it's, although there's a wealth of data now collected, you know, technologies move forward. We've got GPS systems that track athlete movement and they're more widely available. We've got Hawkeye looking at tracking player and ball movements using coordinate data. There are so many aspects that we could analyze, but the difficulty around this is accessing the data. You know, so many doors that could be open to new avenues of research, but the data are not that easy to get hold of. Data ownership, challenges around gaining permission to use the data for the purpose of research are really difficult, and they're definite barriers. I think you alluded to it before, coaching has only recently been allowed in tennis. When I was competing, you weren't allowed on-court coaching. So during matches, coaches were not, you used to get warnings for, if your coach tried to coach you, you used to get a warning, and that could lead to point penalties and game penalties. So even on-court coaching has only just come into the frame in tennis. We're still not allowed body-mounted devices, so GPS and inertial measurement units are not allowed. I think that will change very soon. I believe that's going to change quite soon. But until that happens, we've still got all these major barriers around the use of performance analysis, and they're just additional issues that add to the fact that tennis hasn't been able to embrace performance analysis the way that other sports have been able to so far.
Okay, so if we then start to dig into some of the specific research that you've done in this area of performance analysis in tennis, then linking into informing skill acquisition and coaching by manipulating things with that, starting with those metrics from performance analysis and working onwards, one of the things that came up quite a bit in your research was this idea of the percentage of matches in which the winner outscored the loser. Can you just break that down for me a bit? Treat me like the idiot-proof version that I actually want and need. What is that, and why is it so important to your research?
Okay, so I developed this metric in collaboration with a well-known strategy analyst in tennis called Craig O'Shaughnessy. Craig invited me to the French Open a few years ago so we could analyse the whole tournament. And we discussed the different ways that we could highlight the most important factors in match play in terms of how you win matches. And Craig doesn't necessarily have the academic background. He's got a really excellent coaching background, and he was always fascinated by data and stats, so he kind of taught himself, really. Coming from a slightly more academic perspective, we talked about aspects around reliability and, I suppose, robust data analysis methods. So again, this comes back to the barriers that we find in how we apply performance analysis within tennis. I've seen analysts talk to coaches about t-tests and statistical differences and ANOVAs, and that's one of the most ridiculous things I've seen, because they're academic terms that virtually no coach on the planet would understand. So we developed this idea of using a percentage instead of statistical testing. Now, so you can calculate statistical significance with these, what we call P-wall values, the percentage of winners that outscored the losers for a particular performance metric. You can calculate statistical significance for them if you want to be able to say there's a difference statistically. But that's not the interesting part for coaches, and that's not the part they understand. But most tennis coaches and players would understand if I said to you, if you win more short points than your opponent, there's a 90% chance you're going to win the match. That to a player and a coach and even the general public is fairly straightforward to understand, much more so than saying there's a statistical difference between players who win more short points than their opponent and those that don't. Putting a percentage on it is something that's generally quite familiar to most people, therefore they can interpret and use that however they want to. It's a little bit easier for them to understand. So that was the idea behind creating a metric, and we published a paper to validate that metric, which came right at the start of my PhD, just to demonstrate that we could use this metric and help coaches and players understand, but it does also have some academic grounding in it.
Okay, and I'm not expecting you to, pluck values and statistics out of thin air and just remember everything off by heart, but I'm quite interested roughly in how that relates to, overall match outcome, and how often is it that the winner outscores the loser? Or I guess the more interesting bit is the other way around of how often is it that actually the loser outscores the winner, and therefore what is the, I guess, how big is that relationship really between this metric of winner outscoring loser versus the actual overall outcome of the match that people are really interested in?
So that metric that I just shared with you was accurate. If I play against you in a tennis match and you win more short points than I do, by short points I mean points that last between 0 and 4 shots. If you win more short points than I do in that match, you've got a 90% chance of winning the match. If you win more medium length points, so points that last between 5 and 8 shots, I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but I suspect it's around 68 to 70%. You'll win 68 to 70% of matches. 9 plus, so in the longer points, if you win more longer points than I do, you're talking 60% of matches, 60, 65 perhaps. Again, don't quote me on the figures. I'm not sure. I don't remember them exactly, but we're talking those rough ballparks. So it just shows you the relative importance of short points. If I told you for any single metric that if you outperform your opponent on this metric, you've got a 90% chance of winning the match, for most coaches and players, that's enough to convince them that they need to do really well on that metric. And that's therefore something that they need to focus on in training.
And that's based on a study at Roland Garros and Wimbledon tournaments.
So it is based on that study along with several others. So in my PhD, I compared Roland Garros and Wimbledon because at the time there were only 3 weeks separating those two tournaments, and Roland Garros is contested on clay, Wimbledon's contested on grass courts, and those two surfaces are known to be the most different in terms of the way the game is played on them and the way the surface interacts with the ball and the players. So I wanted to help players better understand that surface transition period and identify the most important performance metrics on the clay, and then really focusing on this 3-week transition period where players have to adapt their game style to compete on this different surface and peak 3 weeks later on grass. I wanted to delve into that 3-week transition really and help players understand what the most important aspects were to focus on to allow them to perform well on the grass courts. Interestingly, the exact same metric came out as really important on the clay and on the grass. So short points came out again. I think it's 88% at Roland Garros. So if you win more short points than your opponent on clay, you've got an 88% chance of winning the match. And I think that was a really interesting one because clay courts in tennis anecdotally are known to be associated with players like Rafael Nadal, players who run for a long time at the back of the court along the baseline, long drawn out rallies. People are knackered after those rallies, and there's anecdotally a feeling that they were the really important ones to win. And they might still be important because of the psychological impact of losing a long point like that. But irrespective of that, still over 70% or almost 70% of all points are over in less than 4 shots on both surfaces. So given that so many points are over within 4 shots, it's still really, really important to focus on those.
Okay, and that comes on to something I was thinking as you were saying it. If you're saying short points of 0 to 4 shots are the most important for winning the match, is that just because there are more of them? Or is it anything a bit more nuanced than that? Is it a case of, this is the most common thing that happens, therefore it's less important to be winning something that happens really rarely than winning something that happens all the time? Is it as simple as that, or am I oversimplifying it?
No, that's certainly a massive part of it. I think there were both of those metrics were important or interesting or surprising. The fact that not just have you got an 88% chance of winning the match on clay if you win more short points, but actually 7 out of 10 points played are over within 4 shots on clay, whereas the general public would and coaches and players would associate clay courts with long drawn out rallies. So it wasn't just, yes, that metric is that 70% is a huge reason why they're so important. And it was also a surprise to me when that came out just how common short points still are on clay. When we think of clay courts as being about those long drawn out rallies where everybody's tired at the end, and it's still important to recognize the importance of the long points, as like I alluded to before. Psychology is a huge part of the sport, as it is in any elite sport really. So there will still be an impact, but if we just look at the direct link between the number of short points, number of medium length points, number of long points that are won, and the chances of somebody winning the match, there's kind of an irrefutable link between those short points and match outcome.
Was there anything else, given your experience as a player and your understanding of conventional coaching wisdom, was there anything else about those results that surprised you, or that often academics like to do these studies and then just tell coaches things they've known for years, and it's kind of, oh, what was the point of that? We already know that. I think famously, like, there was one machine learning study that in basketball I saw recently that ended up like the thing that explained the difference between winning and losing was scoring more points or something stupid like that. And it's like, well, yeah, obviously. Was there anything else in this space that kind of surprised you?
I think that was definitely the most surprising finding around the clay court aspect and short points. I also found in my PhD lots of what you might consider expected findings. So I analysed Hawkeye data that looked at so Hawkeye is ball tracking data and player tracking data. So I looked at where players hit their serves and returns to most commonly, but also most effectively. So which areas of the court do they hit to most commonly, and which areas lead to them winning the point quickly most often. And the results of that study showed me nothing that I couldn't have predicted. The closer you hit to the line more consistently, so the closer you hit to the edge of the court more consistently, the more likely you are to win the point. And that goes for the serve, for the return. That was also a differentiating factor between winning and losing players, particularly on the men's side. So those that hit closer to the line more often are more likely to win the match. It's as simple as that. And similarly with the return, those that are able to return closer to the sidelines of the court are more likely to win the match.
So given all of those things you've just said about people who are better at X are more likely to win the match, you touched on this really early on in the conversation, but when you then put your skill acquisition and coaching hat back on, how does that feed into effective training design? Are there constraints that can be used to encourage, shot 0 to 4 shot length points, or is it some of those other aspects you mentioned, that there are certain constraints that can be successfully used to encourage people to develop those behaviours that can be recommended?
Yeah, so there are a range of things. I think the biggest thing, this importance of short points came across in every study that I conducted in my PhD. I looked at the surface differences. I looked at Wimbledon over time. So I looked right back from 1992 up to 2018. And the importance of short points has never changed. It's always been the most common length of points and the most important, most closely linked to success. So for me, one of the most fun things about my PhD, or interesting aspects of my PhD, was the practical application chapter, because as I talked about earlier, it's all right analysing the data, but actually how do we use it to enhance performance? And I had great fun. This is not going to sound fun for you guys, but I had great fun thinking about the different ways you could manipulate constraints to encourage players to play in a way that meant they were more likely to win matches. Essentially play in a way that meant they were more likely to win short points or end the points quickly. One thing that I did come across within that practical application chapter was there was some evidence from 2 different studies that typically players spend only 10% of practice time concentrating on the serve and only 3% of practice time concentrating on the return of serve. And although that didn't surprise me at the time, because I was a player and I know that 85-90% of your time is spent rallying from the back of the court, having long drawn out rallies, that's not what is important to winning. So there is another aspect to consider here. So yes, we want to make sure that we're training in a way that's more likely to lead to a success on the match court. But secondly, and again, I know this is a player, rhythm and feeling like you have a rhythm is so important. Like I've said, tennis is so psychological. Elite sport is so psychological. If you don't feel it, if you don't feel quite right on the court, on the match court, you're going to really struggle to win, because that feel is not measurable, but it's really important. So what you can't do as an analyst is go in and say, oh, you're doing way too much of this sort of long rallying stuff. You need to do way more on the serve. You need to focus much more on the serve and the return. You're neglecting those areas. You need to change it. Rip up your practice sheets and start again. You can't take that approach. You have to be more nuanced. You have to respect the fact that players and coaches are not daft. They're successful because they know what they're doing. And just because you found a result that's perhaps a bit surprising, it doesn't mean what they're doing currently is wrong. It just means that we can maybe slightly tweak things a little bit to focus slightly more on the serve or the return, or on manipulating the constraints to encourage a few more attacking strategies and playing in a way that's going to end points effectively earlier in the rally. So, it's a delicate balance. And I think, again, that's probably, or perhaps an area where maybe some analysts have fallen down in the past, is that they find this surprising result and suddenly they want to change the world with it. And it's not about that. Elite sport is elite sport, and the people there have worked for decades, literally decades, to get there. They really know what they're doing. It's not about proving them wrong. It's not about showing them that what they're doing is wrong. It's just about providing a little bit more evidence to support their decision making. So it's not down to the analyst to say you need to do this differently. It's down to the analyst to say, I found this finding, I think it's quite interesting. Maybe you want to have a look at it and just, shall we reflect on, or maybe you guys can reflect together on how much time you're affording in practice to these types of things, because these are really important to winning matches.
And given that we are talking about tiny changes to make tiny differences in the chance of winning matches, where that becomes important are in those matches where small differences can actually have an impact, as in, it's not a match that you were always going to win by miles, or a match that you were always going to lose by miles. It's potentially those really closely contested matches. So I wonder, given everything you said around the short points and the importance of that, and even the other aspects linked to it, does that still hold up, or are there any differences in really closely contested matches? Like, is it, as a counter argument, I've got no idea whether this is right or wrong, do the longer points become more important in closely contested matches? And actually, for people with plans on, getting to the final, winning Wimbledon, rather than just competing well in the early rounds, is that then more important to focus on? Or does everything you've said about short points still hold true regardless?
Yeah, everything I've said still holds true, whether it's a close match, whether it's a one-sided match. The reason behind that study was that there is evidence in some other sports, basketball, for example, that the metrics that are most closely linked to success, or that determine success or failure, are different depending on whether the match is closely contested or one-sided. I think in basketball there was a study that said that attempts at 2 and 3 pointers, so basically attempts on goal, were more differentiated between winners and losers more clearly than any other metric, whereas in close matches it was actually winning rebounds that made the difference. So I thought that could be interesting. I wonder if there's anything in that from a tennis perspective. But that helps me answer one of your earlier questions around whether there are any surprises thrown up. That was another study that showed exactly what you would have expected it to show, that the aspects where winners outperform losers in one-sided matches, so when the winners win very easily, are exactly the same metrics that winners outperform losers on in the closely contested matches. There's just a smaller difference between the two players in those close matches, but the same metrics are still important.
And I guess that's really useful. And try not to overthink things, but that's maybe really useful for spectators or people watching even on telly, is that, when we are watching tennis, I think, would you say it's a fair point to say that commentators and spectators potentially focus quite a lot on those long points over other things, and it's actually being aware of the significance of what we're watching, and actually, I guess each point is equally important in some ways, but is it that we kind of remember certain points and focus more on them, and actually their impact on the overall outcome of the match might not be as high as we actually think that it is.
Definitely, yeah. And, this is another application of performance analysis, is helping or providing data to TV companies that help commentators explain the game in more depth to your everyday viewer. So quite often those long points, as you say, are the most memorable points of the match, and they're the ones that the commentators might refer to, or the on-court interviewers after the match might ask the players about, oh, that really long point at 5-3 in the third. That's the conversation that happens. But, they never say, oh, that ace you hit at 3-4 to save break point, because it's not memorable. Because, it wasn't a long drawn out point where they ran along the baseline and then they came to the net and then they went back, and it went on and on and on, and you didn't know who was going to win the point. And, it's not something that as a commentator, a short point as a commentator isn't something that you can ever build up. You can't build momentum as a commentator in a short point. So, it's over almost before it started. So, hopefully this kind of research can also inform commentary, TV crews, the general public around, actually don't just disregard those points, because they're the valuable ones. They're the ones that you need to keep ticking away in the background. And you really want to win those long drawn out points, but because of the psychological impact primarily, rather than because of how often they happen and therefore their impact on the match.
I guess it reinforces that point across a lot of sports around the importance of doing the basics right.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, and then a bit ago you spoke about how you really enjoyed the practical application chapter of your PhD, and the trying to come up with novel constraints that could be applied based on your results and things like that. Any ideas you can share with us, or even I'm really interested in, thought processes that didn't work out, or any bizarre things you thought of and tried that definitely didn't work, or you said about the one example of adding a second baseline that people couldn't go past, but anything else you've either tried that works surprisingly well, or you're aware of people trying and it definitely not working as intended?
So the practical application chapter in my PhD, the reason I found it so interesting to write is because I was able to relate back to a lot of the coaching activities, I suppose, that I'd taken part in as a player. And again, it comes back to my fascination with understanding why I was doing the things that I was doing as a player, and why my coaches and strength and conditioning coach were making the decisions they were making. So a couple of the examples that I share in the practical application chapter around, they're all about encouraging attacking game styles and strategies, and trying to encourage players to finish the point early, because we know that's what's effective. That's what allows you to win more matches. And a couple of them were drills and activities that I had done as a player, and I didn't understand why I was doing them, other than that it suited my game style, but that was as far as it went. Whereas now I understand that actually all of the research, all of the data that I've analysed, all of the evidence that I'm starting to build up, all suggest that that was the right approach that my coaches were taking. Now, as far as I'm aware, my coaches didn't understand or didn't know about the terminology of the constraints-led approach, but I'm absolutely certain that they understood the practicalities of it and how to apply it, even if they didn't know what it was called or what a constraint was in terms of a definition. They understood the concept of it and how it worked in practice. So another example that I shared in my practical application chapter was around time restricted rallies in training. So players do rally a lot in training. You'll see if you ever watch players practice, they'll stand at the baseline and just rally and just get into that rhythm. So the key to this one was putting a time restriction on the amount of time that they could spend rallying in one go. So if you allow players to rally for just 60 seconds and you set the task constraint or the task goal to hit as many strokes as possible within that time frame, that encourages them to explore different ways of basically attacking more. So they change the ball trajectory, because if you hit a high loopier ball, it travels slower over the net. Therefore, you can't hit as many shots in 1 minute as you could otherwise. Players also learn to take a step forward inside the baseline, because they can they can hit more shots again. They can reduce the amount of time the ball takes to get to them by moving forward. And if they both do that, they're both learning to try and hit the ball earlier, so before the ball rises after the bounce. And in time, so these things are not quick fixes. It's important to understand that. It always looks pretty ugly when you first introduce a challenge like this to players. Again, I know that having done it myself. But the idea is that over time, it really effectively teaches them how to attack the ball more effectively, and also at times when they wouldn't necessarily want to or think it's right to, it challenges them to explore their abilities and improve their abilities in how they can, or for example, change defense into attack when they wouldn't necessarily have tried it otherwise. It encourages that exploratory behavior.
If we know that, like you say, it can potentially be hard to change behaviors once people are at a certain level, a certain age, trying to link this back to something we touched on briefly at the start, if we want children to develop these abilities or these kind of tendencies or approaches to play when they're first starting out, what can we do? You mentioned the kind of court size and things like that, but what else can be done in children or in children's tennis to kind of encourage these behaviours?
I think perhaps the more important question is whether you need to encourage those types of behaviours when children start the game, because I think there are bigger priorities at that point, because they need to understand, they do need to understand how to rally from the baseline first before you start challenging them to take more risks and attack the ball and that kind of thing. And I think, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know when is the right time to start introducing these kind of constraints. My gut feel is that that's something that coaches will have a stronger opinion on, or belief on, or stronger knowledge around, better knowledge around. But I think it's worth focusing on other constraints first that just enhance children's skill set, playing ability, forehand, backhand technique, that kind of thing. There are ways to encourage them to explore the court and their own abilities and improve their own abilities that are a few steps before you get to the point where you want to start encouraging different game styles, for example.
And can you tell us a bit about some of those ways, or maybe link to the work you did with the LTA and mini tennis?
Yeah, so for anyone who's not heard of mini tennis is essentially a modified game of tennis where the constraints are manipulated. So when children first start the sport, I think I mentioned it earlier, you can't put them on a full-size court with full-size rackets and proper tennis balls, because they won't be able to play the game effectively. It also risks injury, because when the ball bounces very high, they end up reaching above their head with a heavy tennis racket too often, and we risk overuse injuries and things. So mini tennis is played on smaller courts with lower nets, lighter, softer balls, and smaller, lighter rackets. And there are 3 stages. So there's mini tennis red, which is the smallest stage for the youngest children. Then they move on to mini tennis orange, and then they move through to mini tennis green, before eventually around the age of 10 or 11 moving into proper tennis, or adult tennis, if you like. And the idea behind mini tennis just like any other modified sport, was to allow children to learn the game more effectively, enhance their skill development, and allow them to play the game in a way that looked a little bit more like adult tennis than it would do otherwise. The issue was that mini tennis was implemented all around the world without any evidence that it worked. So nobody had actually done research beforehand to check whether the reasons they wanted to implement it were actually going to happen if they did implement it. So actually, as an undergraduate student, I realized this and chose to focus on it for my third year dissertation. So I went out and filmed loads and loads of tennis matches and spent weeks coding them, analyzing them, which was not very fun. Any analyst will attest to that. And I compared what the game looks like at each different level of mini tennis and then compared them all to adult tennis. And what I found was, on the positive side, that mini tennis, the average rally length in mini tennis matches was much higher than the average rally length in adult tennis. So the average rally length in the adult tennis matches I filmed was around 4 shots per rally, whereas in mini tennis red, for example, with the youngest children, they were able to maintain 8 shots per rally. So from a skill acquisition perspective, that's fantastic, because mini tennis is giving them more opportunities to practice and therefore develop their shots and their technique. So that's brilliant. But on the other side, in adult tennis, we see roughly a 50% split between forehands and backhands. So we hit half forehands, half backhands, roughly. And in the on the mini tennis side of things, particularly at mini tennis red, but this persisted throughout the mini tennis stages, young players were hitting around 70% of shots as a forehand and only 30% as a backhand. And as far as I'm aware, coaches didn't know that. I was surprised at that. I didn't know that was going to come out. It makes sense, because the forehand is an easier shot for young children to learn. So they want to hit it whenever they can, because the backhand's more difficult, more challenging to learn. But the problem comes when they get to adult tennis and suddenly they're required to hit 50% backhands instead of only 30% backhands. And because the constraints have changed and the ball travels more quickly through the air and the court they have to cover is now bigger, they can't move around. When the ball goes to the backhand side of the court, they haven't got the time to move around it and play a forehand, where in mini tennis they would have had that additional time. So what was interesting, well, if you think about it, the potential problem with that is in time they can develop a weakness on their backhand. Their backhand isn't as strong as their forehand. And interestingly, at the same time as I published that research, a book chapter came out that had analysed the best British under 14 players. And in that study, they'd found that their backhands were all weaker than their forehands. I thought, I might have the reason for that. So what I did for my master's dissertation was try and solve that problem, was try to manipulate the constraints on the young players in their training design in a way that would encourage them to develop their backhand. And again, coming back to something I mentioned at the very start, I wanted to do this without explicitly having to tell them, you need to hit more backhands, or your backhand's not very good, you need to improve your backhand. The idea was to design the environment in a way that I knew would encourage them, or I hoped would encourage them, to develop their backhand in a more equitable way as their forehand. So I made 3 manipulations to the constraints for the mini tennis. I was working with 2 mini tennis red groups at the time, so which was fortunate, because I had a control group, ready-made control group, and an experimental group. So the control group just undertook their regular training sessions as they would. They used to play for an hour a week, as the experimental group did. And their training designs were essentially the same. They would have a normal warm-up. They'd have 1 or 2 drills and activities, skill practices. They'd do something games or points based at the end, and then they'd have a warm down and cool down and wrap up of the session. And with the experimental group, I slightly changed the court design. So in mini tennis, it's very common, well, in any tennis court, there's a centre line down the centre of the court. And in mini tennis, we're lucky in that the courts aren't drawn out for, they're not painted for us. We design them, we put markers down to create the courts, because they're smaller than a standard court. So I could move the centre line. What's also common in mini tennis is coaches putting recovery boxes at the centre of the baseline, because what you often see if you watch children learn tennis is they run to one side of the court to hit a shot and they forget to run back to the middle afterwards. So the next ball is a winner and it goes straight past them because they're too far out of court and they haven't recovered. So quite typically you'll see a recovery box at the centre of the baseline just to encourage them to get back to the middle. So as two of the constraint manipulations for my experimental group, I moved the centre line and the recovery box slightly into the forehand side of the court. So it reduced the size of the forehand half of the court and increased the size of the backhand side of the court. Being 5 and 6 years old, they didn't really notice and didn't think to ask anything of it. So it didn't require any explanation. But what they are always encouraged to do when they're learning the sport is typically to hit a forehand if it comes to one side, if the ball lands on one side of the centre line, and a backhand if it lands on the other side. But changing the location of the centre line and the recovery box meant that they were less likely to be able to run around the shot if it came to the backhand side to try and hit a forehand. That was the idea. The third manipulation was that in any points-based activity, the coaches were allowed to award bonus points if they saw a player try to put their opponent under pressure using their backhand. So if they tried to hit a really strong shot with their backhand, then the coach could award them a bonus point. Now, we obviously can't leave it up to the players to award themselves bonus points because they'd be awarding them left, right and centre. So it had to be down to the coach, which meant that the players didn't know if the coaches were watching. So they didn't know if they would always get one, but it encouraged them to do it more and more because in the hope that sometimes the coach will be watching and sometimes I'll get a bonus point for it. And the rationale behind that manipulation was that because the backhand's harder to learn, quite often you'll see children just push it or bunt it, as we would say in tennis, over the net. So the swing is very short and very limited and restricted. They're never going to win the point by using the shot like that. And we wanted them to explore their technical ability and try and find new ways of hitting a stronger, better, more effective backhand. So by offering bonus points, which is an incentive for them, it encouraged them to start to learn how to swing the racket more and explore how they could attack the shot to try and put their opponent under pressure. The results from that study, we did an 8-week intervention and the results were really, really positive. So we'd hoped that it would slightly rebalance the split between the percentage of forehands and backhands hit, and it did. We had afterwards the experimental group were almost hitting 50% forehands and 50% backhands, which is much more representative of what happens in the adult game. And we also had some technical assessment done. So of all the videos that I'd collected, I asked 2 independent coaches to rate each player's forehand and backhand technique separately. And what we found was that the experimental group's backhand improved, which was great, but it was also kind of expected because that was the whole purpose of the intervention, was to improve their backhands. What was really interesting was that actually their forehand technique improved more than the control groups as well, even though they weren't hitting as many forehands. And at first, I mean, it was great, but I didn't know why until I broke it down. And when I thought about it, what it showed me was that, or what I realized, I think, was that the experimental group, where before the intervention, they'd been choosing to try to hit forehands when it was not appropriate to hit a forehand. So they were really rushing themselves, and therefore they were not in a sensible position. Their body was not, positioned sensibly to hit the forehand stroke. So they were off balance, for example. Whereas afterwards, they'd have chosen to hit a backhand on that same shot, and they chose to hit forehands only when it was appropriate to hit forehands. So they hadn't necessarily hugely improved their forehand technique, but what they had done is cut out a lot of the instances where they had exhibited poor forehand technique previously.
Okay, in either junior tennis or senior tennis, is there anything you're involved in at the moment that you're excited about, or anything you're able to tell us about ongoing or future work in this space?
Yeah, so I currently have 2 PhD students who I'm supervising who are both conducting research into different aspects of performance analysis. So one is looking to create a biomechanical model of the serve to try and help players understand how they can optimize their technique, how they can improve their serve. And the other student is aiming to use IMUs, inertial measurement units, body mounted devices, to try to automate some of the collection of basic performance data, really. So one of the biggest drawbacks of performance analysis is the manual nature of it, the time it takes to code matches and essentially count what's happening. So the more we can start to automate that process, the better. I've also got another PhD student due to start in October, who is going to collaborate with the Loughborough University National Tennis Academy, which are based on campus with us, which is a fantastic opportunity because the best British junior players play there. So one thing I've always been really interested in is that transition from the junior game to the senior game, because we often see that players who succeed in juniors go on to succeed in the senior game. But on the other side, we also see players who didn't really have much impact in the junior game suddenly come through as 18, 19-year-olds and have a real impact in the senior game. So understanding what the junior game looks like, the demands physically, technically, tactically of the elite end of the junior game is hopefully going to really help us optimize our junior players training and, align that with or look at the pathway of how they develop through into the senior game to try and optimize that success when they transition into the senior game. The other thing we're doing more recently is we've got a collaboration with the Rafa Nadal Tennis Academy in Mallorca and the Rafa Nadal School of Sport at UAX University in Madrid. So we're hoping to collaborate with them to start to conduct some studies, potentially or very likely involving a constraints-led approach. First of all, that's probably likely to involve some educational workshops for their players and coaches around, constraints in general, how it works, how it can be effective. But then in time, looking at some intervention studies, again, hopefully to demonstrate the benefits of that approach.
And if anyone listening to this wants to learn more about that as well, is there anything you can recommend for people that want to find out more about your work or more about this area in general?
Yeah, some of my papers are available open access online. The references will be available on my Loughborough staff profile webpage. I am also on ResearchGate, so anyone's absolutely welcome to get in touch at any point if they're interested in just chatting or learning more about these different approaches and performance analysis and the constraints-led approach. Academic journal articles are not always easy to read. I'm sure you appreciate that. But the nature of my work is really applied, and I've always been conscious that I want coaches and players to be able to access and understand it if they want to. So a couple of my articles, I've also published more accessible, coach-friendly, crucially shorter versions, which are freely available in the ITF's Sports Science and Coaching Review Journal, which is a fantastic crossover journal that translates, if you like, applied research into more accessible, easy to understand research for the layperson and coaches, players, athletes, that kind of thing.
And as a final question, then, with Wimbledon coming up at the moment, if push for time, so if you can choose one thing, either personally or professionally, what are you most looking forward to seeing at Wimbledon?
Having done lots of research around different court surfaces, I find it really interesting watching the very top players and specifically how they adapt their game for grass, because it's not easy to do. As a Brit, I know this is going slightly off tangent, but as a Brit, I loved the grass court season, partly because my game style suited the surface, but more so because I constantly used to hear international players complaining about it. They all hated it. So, that's why I'm really pleased to be trying to help the next generation of British players and optimise their success, particularly on the grass, because I know that lots of international players do not enjoy playing on the surface at all, and we probably get slightly more opportunity to train on it than they do. I always have an eye on kind of the playing styles that are happening and the styles that are successful, because again, that aligns really closely to my research, but I'm also looking for where is the game going? What do we need to prepare our players for in the future, not just now?
Thanks, Anna. And yeah, you've definitely given me a lot to think about, and I'll probably be watching slightly differently as well, and not just focusing on those long shots and the really long rallies, and maybe not listening to the commentators quite as much. But yeah, thanks, Anna. It's been really good to chat and really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.